And you also see this presentation mode.
Yes.
Okay. So again, as I started saying that when we there's one slide to further define this cataloging, but basically, you know, understand this as the intention to set some structure and guidance in terms of when we collecting those implementation situations or stories, um, and what should be a basic structure, so we can start to labeling those cases, scenarios, situations, however we call it, uh, into a sort of a case database that we can use that to further analyze this so-called implementation gap. So to start with, we thought, well, at least we should define implementation. Uh, and again, here we quickly offer two very simplistic uh, uh, type of implementation. And by itself, clearly, everybody will feel there's much of this definition thing we can discuss, but that's not the focus today. Today is just basically tell you this is so far what we think. The first one basically just in terms of the big category, say, yes, there's a very specifically defined plan and or something to be implemented. And with that, you have actions, actors, and even resource allocations, goals, expectations, timeline, all those are specified. So we call this type a planned implication. So of course, most of the so-called implementation things, discussions, research falling into this type, be that is a policy or specific project or any kind of plan, and even initiatives, so on and so forth. And in addition to this, as Rob already mentioned earlier, we thought there's also another type, uh, basically meaning the things that there's a wider expectation or even assumption that some kind of implementation plan should exist, or should be on agenda, but it's not. So if you want, think of 20, 30 years of climate change, you have many of that example. The scientist has been talking about for so long before since our start moving on to agenda. We also have a small uh, examples of those. So we call that anticipatory implementation. So the reason we differentiate those two is, for one, for example, adding the second one, really to see that, moving something onto agenda uh, also have uh, very far-reaching implications on the implementation. Uh, Therefore, it is meaningful also including this type of implementation into the thinking. So, of course, that typology, meaning this too broad, big brush type of implementation can be further nuanced. And here we just give three examples of the aspects along which you can further uh, characterize any kind of implementation. Uh, we the two types basically say, oh, plan, no plan. But in reality, it's really you often say it's actually never that clean cut. There must be a lot of it's a spectrum. Some may have a sort of plan, and a more or less. So even with this plan, no plan, is a spectrum rather than a crystal sort of a cut. And you could also think about, even with a plan, the underlying planning perspective is often is different. And some are really guided by this flexible, adaptive kind of plan, which is increasingly now picking up in certain field with the resilience building, so on and so forth, as a trend. Whereas if you go back time enough, you will say more of this prescriptive plan. Everything is decided and fixed. So again, that is a spectrum. And if we look at any specific implementation stories or situations, perhaps you can, on this spectrum, make a point, say, yeah, lies somewhere here. And similarly, in terms of actors, which we think is absolutely a key aspects in understanding the implementation situation or processes, you also have this, and some are really clearly defined with rules and the responsibilities, whereas others are quite fuzzy, and some are basically just imagined or assumed. So in terms of, again, this, we call that spectrum of clarity of actors. We, and sometimes you see those words, we and the, it, and some of those are clearly defined, others are really fuzzy. So again, those are just three additional sort of things that we can think if we want to add much more nuance on the types of implementation. And I'm sure there's many such aspects or dimensions that we can think of. But this is just to illustrate we can progressively complicate this often very complex situation. So then what we mean by a implementation gap catalog, as I earlier said, is basically a data collection, data in the sense of we're collecting implementation situations as the raw data and the cases. So in that case, it's really a case base. If I can steal that database basic concept. Um, and then uh, we thought just give a very broad definition of what implementation situation and is again there. We can continue to enrich that, but basically what we mean is description narrative about a particular implementation case. Here you would say that even the description slash narrative is really, there's no the description or the narrative of any particular implementation cases. It's very much actor dependent. If you ask different actors, uh, you you often would get a different description, a different narrative about any particular implementation case. But just to embed that complexity, we call it implementation situation. Um, so then, this is a long, dragging sentence, but basically says that when we see cataloging, it's really to gather those basic descriptions in terms of information, data, so on and so forth. And it's not uh, the intention of the cataloging itself will be the gap analysis, but for collecting the information, we also expect that we hear the perceived gaps uh, from all the actors, with the assumption that different actors always tell you there's some gap, but they in their own version. So the collecting those um, uh, also as raw data, part of the raw data, meaning how the actors involved perceive those gaps. So this is basically the background to move on what we think could be some suggested structure for collecting those implementation situations, or for anyone who are willing to submit, add an entry to this implementation situation to give some kind of guidance and structure what kind of information would be needed. So we again structure this and to the two types of implementation. One is this type one, the planned one. Um, I will not spend time on this, but just for you to keep in mind, I think some of you are well familiar with this to nail the furniture to the wall example is a typical planned implementation. This is the story of after the Kobe earthquake, this idea of if you can nail your furnitures to the wall, that can mitigate the risk when earthquake happens. And then they discovered that actually for the elderly people, there's a huge resistance about this. So the implementation because become really unsatisfactory. That story. So here you can see there's various actors involved in this, and the different of them have a different view, so on and so forth. But I will not go into this just to give you, say, for example, this would be a typical example of that. For this type of planned information, and we think uh, the top level, when you start to describe this implementation situation, we would say very logical, straightforward, ask three questions. And the first one is, of course, what to be implemented. Uh, and the second is how it has been implemented, and what are the results so far. It's nothing more to say about this. Very straightforward, three questions. Um, and then we thought, and if we think those are the first level sort of guiding questions, then under each, we started to think of what could be in that. Of course, in the context of disaster risk reduction, we always need to have some information of nature of the risk. Um, that with this group, I don't need to say anything. Uh, about this more. And it's basically we need some information on the risk to which the implementation is intended to reduce the risk. And then naturally, you need to describe the implementation plan. And there, again, as you can see on the screen, we have some example questions, which again is very logical, simple, direct questions. What are the goals, outcomes, so on, timelines, who owns the plan, that often also link to the actor expectations and the rules and responsibilities. Um, so then, other stakeholders, meaning that in addition to the people responsible have a direct role in any implementation, and what are other stakeholders, and whether there's any kind of engagement expectations or processes, so on and so forth. So this is the first one. And marked yellow there is we all recognize uh, this local context is extremely important. But how do we offer any structured way to further characterize that local context? We haven't thought too much in that, but we just thought that the local context also is an important part of this first domain of information, if you want, in terms of what to be implemented. And then the second domain of information is the actual process, how it was and has been implemented. Of course, here the heavy focus is we need information on the actors and actions, who did what, when, and how. And we also link those to the resources, um, and as well as information on the governance structure and the stakeholder interaction. Uh, and it's supposed to be engagement. It's horrible typo. And are there any kind of communication, so on and so forth. Again, you can see this is just an example list in terms of what should be included to substantiate the second domain of information. So the third one is the result part. Um, yeah, it's description of the result. Often, I guess this depends on which actor is telling the story. Um, and that's why we saw perhaps it's useful to say is there consensus on the results and observations from actors on the gaps. Um, so again, just very quickly, this is how we think for this type 1 planned implementation. Very similarly, but framed in a slightly different way because of the, the logic behind it, right? And the type 1 is with a plan, but type 2 is not on agenda yet. Therefore, the question we ask is, I will not talk about this. One of the example that we talked about is Kami one time told us this snow traffic jam thing in Japan. Everybody is frustrated, yet at the same time, turns out it's nobody's responsibility. Um, but anyway, again, if we still think about the first level 3 information domain for this type, the first one, instead we ask what to be implemented, and this logically become what should have been implemented. And then the second one is really could it be implemented? The third one is again, the who should do what if it is. So again, I hope the logic comes through clearly, say, because this is something not on agenda, so we slightly ask those 3 questions in a different way. But the logic is very much remain the same. And for this, what have been implemented, we will say what is the problem and what kind of plan should have been expected. Um, uh, it again, you see the similar structure with type 1, but framed different. Yeah, I just give you a little bit, you read that instead of hear my voice all the time. Yeah, the last one is who should do what if it is, again, it's those questions of who should be involved, what are the actions, what are the enablers or enabling conditions. Um, what could be the anticipated challenges for implementation. So very quickly, this is just a run through. I don't have any more. Again, we started by this background of we're collecting implementation situations to be the sort of the primary data to do further analysis on implementation gap. In order to do that, we are thinking about some kind of a cataloging exercise where we will ask everybody to contribute cases. For guiding a little bit of that contribution, we started to construct this basic structure and attributes for this cataloging exercise. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on this, but that's basically what I got to say. Thank you very much.